A disgraced ex-cop, middle-aged man, brown eyes, straight nose, full lips, strong jawline. Short, wavy, dark brown hair, light stubble, finds an abandoned K9 unit. Large, muscular German shepherd, deep brown eyes, thick black and tan fur, erect. Ears, scar over his left flank left to die in the streets. As he pieces together the dog's past, he discovers a web of corruption connecting a notorious biker gang to a man who controls the city's underground. Teaming up with an old friend, they set out to dismantle the operation from within. But the deeper they dig, the more dangerous the game becomes. As their enemies close in, the fight turns personal. Light Stubble must decide how far he's willing to go for justice, because in a city built on silence, the only way to bring down a king is to make enough noise to shake the foundations. And once the war starts, there's no turning back. Hold. On a moment before we move forward, let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The bitter wind howled through the desolate alleyways of Chicago, carrying with it the scent of rotting garbage and the metallic tang of impending snowfall. Streetlights flickered weakly against the darkness, their glow failing to penetrate the filth and misery embedded in every cracked pavement and graffiti-stained wall. The city never truly slept. But in the forgotten corners, where only the desperate lingered, silence hung like a noose, interrupted only by the occasional siren wailing in the distance. Rex moved with calculated precision, his powerful frame betraying the ghost of discipline long buried beneath years of hardship. His ribs pressed against his skin like the worn-out frame of a rusted car, the once proud sheen of his fur now dulled by grime and time. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but he ignored it. His sharp senses locked onto the trash bin ahead. He had learned the hard way that the city was merciless to those who hesitated. The stench of spoiled meat and moldy bread was a perfume compared to the gnawing void in his stomach. With a swift motion, he toppled the bin, his paws landing lightly against the cold asphalt. A rat darted from the pile, but Rex didn't flinch. Once he might have chased it, years ago when he had a full belly and a handler who called him partner. Now there was no chase, no purpose, only survival. Footsteps echoed down the alley. Instincts honed by years of training kicked in, and Rex froze, his ears perking up, his body lowering into the shadows. He knew better than to trust humans. The last time he had dared to believe in one, he had been left behind like trash, discarded by the very man he would have given his life for. A group of men loitered near a back door, their leather jackets marked with a crimson jackal, the same emblem Rex had come to recognize as danger. He had seen their kind before, loud, cruel, reeking of gasoline, sweat, and blood. They laughed, their voices dripping with malice, their hands gesturing toward a stray dog that had wandered too close. The poor thing, a scrawny mutt with mismatched fur and a hesitant wag, stood frozen, its tail tucked between its legs. "Bet you $50 I can break its leg with one kick," one of them sneered, adjusting his stance as he prepared to lunge. Rex moved before he could think. His body propelled forward, a blur of muscle and instinct, and before the man's boot could make contact, Rex sank his teeth into his calf. A scream tore through the night, a grotesque mixture of shock and pain. The others cursed, moving toward him, but Rex released his grip and darted away before they could react. He didn't look back, didn't stop running until the alley had swallowed him whole. His breath came in short, labored bursts, the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. He had been reckless. He knew better than to get involved. The streets demanded detachment. Anything else led to suffering. But something about that moment, about that trembling dog, had triggered something long buried inside him, a memory of obedience, of service, of standing at the side of a man he had once trusted with everything. Rex shook the thought away and focused on the present. He needed to find shelter before the night swallowed him completely. Police cruiser rolled down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Rex knew the sound of those engines, the pattern of their patrols. Once he had been part of that world. Now he was just another stray in the city's underbelly. He shrank deeper into the shadows, watching as the car slowed. Inside, Officer John McBelt exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. His first month on the force had been a baptism by fire, a crash course in the corruption and decay that infested Chicago's underbelly. He had grown up idolizing the badge, believing in justice, but the reality was a suffocating weight pressing. Against his ribs, the city had rules, and not all of them were written in law books. He squinted through the windshield, catching sight of movement in the alley. A dog, large, muscular, moving with a caution that screamed experience. Not just any stray. There was something about the way it held itself, the way its eyes scanned the area with practiced vigilance. John pulled the car over and stepped out cautiously. The dog didn't run, but it didn't approach either. It simply stood there, waiting, studying him. "Easy, boy," John murmured, kneeling slowly and extending a hand. "Not gonna hurt you." Rex didn't move. He had heard those words before, empty promises from hollow men. Trust was a currency he no longer dealt in. John reached into his pocket and pulled out the remnants of a sandwich. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Rex's nose twitch. Hunger was a cruel master, and for a moment instinct overpowered caution. He stepped forward, just enough to snatch the offering from John's hand before retreating a few paces, devouring the meal. As if it might be his last, John watched, his heart clenching. He'd seen that look before, on people, on victims, on those who had been left behind by a world that didn't care. This wasn't just a dog. This was something else, something broken, something familiar. He glanced at the scars lining the dog's body, the healed-over wounds of battles fought and survived. And then he saw it, a faint marking under the dirt, barely visible but unmistakable. A police tag, a K9 unit tattoo. John's breath hitched. "You're not just any dog, are you?" Rex's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but his gaze remained wary, distant. He had made the mistake of believing in loyalty before, and it had cost him everything. But John wasn't looking away. And for the first time in a long time, neither was Rex. The city breathed in hushed whispers, the distant hum of traffic punctuated by the occasional honk or the wail of a siren cutting through the thick night air. The cold settled into John McBelt's bones as he knelt on the pavement, his eyes locked onto the dog standing just beyond his reach. The animal didn't cower, didn't snarl, didn't beg. It simply watched him, waiting. John had seen that look before, on victims who had lost everything, on kids pulled from broken homes, on men who had fought battles no one else could see. It was a look that said, "You can try, but I won't trust you." Not yet. He moved slowly, standing and stepping back toward his squad car, keeping his movements unthreatening. The dog, because that was the only word his mind could settle on for now, even though he already knew this wasn't just a dog, stayed rooted in place, muscles coiled and ready. John reached into the car, grabbed another half-eaten sandwich from the passenger seat and tore off a chunk, tossing it onto the ground between them. "Go ahead, buddy." No strings attached. The dog didn't move immediately. Its nose twitched, eyes flicking between John and the food, assessing the risk. But hunger was stronger than fear. Finally it inched forward, snatched up the offering and retreated, chewing quickly as though someone might rip it away at any second. John took a slow breath, his heart pounding more than he cared to admit. He'd seen plenty of strays in this city, but none like this. This one carried himself differently, like a soldier who had seen war and come back, not quite whole. Something about that felt too damn familiar. A gust of wind cut through the alley, kicking up loose scraps of newspaper. The dog flinched slightly, but held its ground. Its ribs jutted out against the thin layer of fur, and its paws were raw, cracked from too many nights on concrete and asphalt. John sighed, glancing up at the black sky, then back down. "You got a name?" The dog stared. John exhaled a quiet laugh. "Yeah, I figured you wouldn't tell me." He crouched again, resting his forearms on his knees. "I'm McBelt, Chicago PD. Not exactly the best time to be a cop in this city, but I try not to be one of the bad ones. What about you? You on the run too?" Silence. The dog sat, as if answering without words. Something in John's chest ached, the distant screech of tires yanked both their heads toward the main road. A pair of motorcycles roared past, their riders clad in leather vests marked with the emblem John had learned to recognize too well, the Crimson Jackals. His jaw tightened. They were getting bolder, slithering into parts of the city they hadn't touched before, creeping their poison into every neighborhood. He'd had run-ins with their type before, men who operated in the shadows, moving drugs and weapons while making sure the right pockets were lined to keep the heat off. They were untouchable in ways that made John sick. And yet, as he turned back toward the dog, something shifted in his gut. The animal had stiffened, ears pricked, body humming with tension. But it wasn't fear. It was something sharper, something trained. John had seen K9s react like that before. His gaze flickered to the faint markings beneath the grime on the dog's fur, the tattoo. "You're not just some stray, are you?" he murmured. The dog didn't move, but its eyes locked onto his in a way that felt too damn human. John let the thought settle. There were only a few ways a K9 ended up on the streets like this. None of them were good. Something in his chest tightened. The kind of anger that came slow, like embers glowing beneath the ashes. Who the hell would abandon a partner like this? John straightened and exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said more to himself than the dog. "Let's figure this out." He reached toward the squad car's back door and popped it open. The dog's ears twitched. John lifted his hand slightly. "No pressure, buddy. Your choice. But I can tell you right now, you're not going to last much longer out here." The dog didn't move. John waited. A full 30 seconds passed before the animal finally took a step forward. Then another. It didn't leap into the car, didn't wag its tail, didn't do anything that said trust. But it moved closer. That was enough. John stepped back, giving the dog room as it hesitated just beside the door. Then slowly, reluctantly, it climbed inside. John swallowed the lump in his throat. He shut the door. That was the moment everything changed. John drove in silence, keeping the radio off. He glanced at the rearview mirror every so often, watching. The dog, as it sat stiff in the back seat, ears flicking at the passing sounds of the city, it didn't relax. It didn't curl up. It just watched. John drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. "I should take you to a shelter," he muttered. The dog's ears twitched, as if it understood. John exhaled a quiet chuckle. "Yeah, I don't think you'd like that." He turned onto a quieter street, the flashing neon lights giving way to dim apartment windows. He had no real plan. Hell, he hadn't thought past the moment the dog climbed into his car, but there was something in the back of his mind. A whisper he couldn't shake, a K9 unit abandoned, a gang moving deeper into the city. Something didn't sit right. The tattoo on the dog's skin nagged at him. John made a decision. He pulled into a small parking lot outside an old veterinarian's office. He knew the guy who ran it, Dr. Evans, an ex-military medic who still believed in saving things that the rest of the world gave up on. John turned off the engine and looked back. "Let's get you checked out." The dog didn't move. John sighed and stepped out, opening the back door. The dog hesitated for a long moment. Then, slowly, it jumped down onto the pavement, its nails clicking softly against the concrete. John took a breath, one step at a time, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't taking them alone. Dr. Evans rubbed his stubbled chin, eyes narrowed as he scanned the handheld scanner over the dog's shoulder. The faint beep echoed in the sterile room, bouncing. Off the metal table where the dog sat, stiff but obedient, his dark eyes never leaving John's face. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. The walls smelled of antiseptic and faded memories of animals who had come through these doors. sick, broken, waiting for something or someone to save them. John had seen this room before, years ago, back when Evans still worked on officers' K9 units, patching up war dogs that had seen things no living being should have to endure. Evans' brow furrowed. Well, well, he muttered, adjusting the scanner. Looks like our boy here has a past. John's chest tightened. Evans turned the screen toward him, tapping a smudged finger against the small line of numbers displayed there. He's chipped. Police registry. John exhaled, slowly. He had expected it, but hearing the confirmation sent a bitter weight settling into his stomach. Evans moved to his computer, typing quickly. The glow of the screen reflected off his glasses, highlighting the growing tension in his face. Give me a second. If the registry's still intact, I can pull up his details. The dog, Rex, John was beginning to call him in his mind, even if he wasn't certain yet, remained unmoving. His body was still as stone, his ears slightly tilted. Forward, his breathing even but controlled. He was waiting, watching. John wondered how many times this dog had sat in a room like this, being examined like a piece of equipment instead of a partner. Evans grunted. Got it. John moved closer. On the screen, a record appeared. Name, Rex, K9. Unit, Chicago PD assigned. Handler, Officer Martin Grayson. Status, decommissioned. John's stomach twisted. The name hit him like a fist to the gut. Martin Grayson. The last time he had heard that name, it had been spat through gritted teeth, whispered in the back rooms of the precinct like something foul that no one wanted to acknowledge. Corrupt. A disgrace to the force. A man who had been quietly dismissed before his crimes could drag others down with him. A man who had once worn the badge John now carried. Evans clicked on the status field. More information loaded. K9 Rex decommissioned following handler dismissal. Removed from service. Status unknown. John felt his pulse in his throat. They just let him go. Evans sat back, arms crossed. Looks that way. His voice was tight, like he was holding back the same frustration John felt rising. Probably didn't even go through the proper process. A dog like this doesn't just disappear from records unless someone wants it to. John turned toward Rex, who remained impassive, but something about the way his ears flicked told him the dog knew, maybe not the details, but he understood the weight in the room. Grayson had abandoned him. John inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Can you access anything on Grayson? Last known address, connections? Evans hesitated. John, just look. The older man sighed, but his fingers moved over the keys, tapping in Grayson's name. The screen flickered as records populated. Last, a known residence. An old apartment complex on the south side of the city. No employment listed. No legal records after his dismissal, but the name wasn't forgotten. Evans muttered a curse. That bastard's been busy. John followed his gaze. On the screen, multiple reports flagged Grayson's name in connection with suspected gang activity. And not just any gang, the Crimson Jackals. John's hands clenched at his sides. The same gang that had been creeping further into the city. The same gang whose members he had seen tormenting a stray dog just hours ago. The same gang Rex had attacked without hesitation. John swallowed hard, pieces falling into place too quickly. Too violently. Grayson hadn't just abandoned his K9 partner. He had thrown him away like garbage after turning his loyalty elsewhere. Evans shook his head. You know what this means, don't you? John knew. It meant Grayson was still out there, walking free, using the knowledge he once had as a cop to work for the same criminals John had sworn to fight. And Rex, loyal, trained, forged in duty, had been discarded because he didn't fit into the corruption. John let out a slow breath, steadying the anger that burned beneath his skin. I need to find him, Evans sighed. That's a dangerous road, John. I don't care. Evans studied him for a long moment, then looked at Rex, who had barely moved, but was listening to every word. Finally, he nodded. Then you'd better start by keeping this one close. He reached into a drawer, pulling out a roll of gauze and disinfectant. He's in decent shape, all things considered, but those paws need tending. He's been running on concrete too damn long." John watched as Evans moved with careful hands, cleaning the raw pads on Rex's paws. The dog barely reacted, accepting the treatment with silent tolerance. When Evans finished, he stood back and dusted off his hands. "So, what's the plan?" John exhaled, his fingers brushing over Rex's fur. The dog didn't flinch, didn't lean in, but didn't pull away. Either it wasn't trust, not yet. But it was something. "I bring him home," John said. Evans arched an eyebrow. "You sure about that? He's not just some house pet. That dog's got history." John's gaze didn't waver. "So do I." Evans smirked. "Fair enough." John reached into his wallet, pulling out a few bills, but Evans waved a hand. "Don't insult me, just take care of him." John nodded, then turned to Rex. "Come on, buddy." The dog hesitated only briefly before hopping off the table. John opened the door, and for the first time since finding him in the alley, Rex didn't pause. He walked beside John as they stepped into the cold night, their footsteps echoing against the pavement. The city loomed ahead, vast and indifferent, but John felt something shift inside him. He had come to Chicago looking for purpose, looking for something that still made sense in a world where the lines of justice had blurred. And now beside him walked a shadow from another life, one that had been thrown away. Just like so many others this city had chosen to forget. John wasn't sure what he was stepping into, but as Rex kept pace beside him, something told him this was only the beginning. John pulled into his apartment's small parking lot, the engine humming low as he killed the ignition. The neighborhood wasn't the worst Chicago had to offer, but it wasn't the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked either. The security light above his unit flickered weakly, barely pushing back the night. Rex sat in the passenger seat, rigid eyes scanning every movement outside. His ears flicked with each distant sound, a car door slamming, the scuff of shoes on pavement, a muffled argument behind a closed window. He was assessing everything, cataloguing potential threats. John unbuckled his seatbelt, watching him. "You always this paranoid, or is that just a habit from your last gig?" Rex didn't react. John sighed and stepped out, opening the passenger door. "Come on, let's get inside before someone decides to ask questions." Rex hesitated, staring at him for a long moment, before finally hopping down onto the cracked pavement. He followed John up the stairs, his steps light despite the exhaustion in his body. His gait was smooth, controlled, but John had seen the subtle stiffness in his muscles when he moved. Too many nights on the street, too many fights for food, shelter, survival. John unlocked his door and pushed it open, stepping aside to give Rex space. He had no idea what to expect. The dog had spent who knew how long fending for himself. Would he even want to come inside? For a second, Rex just stood there. His nose twitched as he took in the scent of the place. Faint traces of coffee, leather, old wood, and the lingering smell of gun oil. He didn't cross the threshold immediately. John waited. Rex finally took one step forward, then another. His paws barely made a sound as he entered, moving cautiously, scanning the space the way a soldier would check a room before moving in. John shut the door behind them and tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter. He flicked on a lamp, the soft yellow light cutting through the dimness. "Welcome home," he muttered. Rex sniffed at the air, padding toward the couch. He didn't jump onto it, just examined the fabric, the creases, the worn armrests, as if trying to determine if it was real. Then he turned, sitting near the doorway, still watching John. The distance between them felt like something unspoken. John ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. "All right, let's get a few things straight. You're not a stray anymore. You don't have to fight for scraps. You don't have to sleep outside." Rex didn't move. John exhaled and moved toward the kitchen. He pulled open the fridge, searching through its limited contents. His job didn't exactly allow for home-cooked meals, so his options weren't great. Mostly takeout containers and cheap beer. He grabbed a pack of deli turkey and ripped it open. Not exactly high class, but it's food. Rex's nose twitched, but he didn't lunge. John crouched, holding out a small handful. "Go ahead." Rex hesitated. Then, finally, he leaned forward, lips barely brushing John's fingers as he took the food. He ate quickly, but not frantically. He wasn't some starving street mutt. There was control in the way he moved, in the way he accepted the food without desperation. John watched him. "Yeah, you were trained right." He didn't know why that thought made something twist inside him. Maybe it was because he knew how hard it was to break training like that. Maybe it was because Rex had clearly been let down by someone who should have stood by him. Maybe it was because John knew what that felt like. He stood, tossing the empty plastic into the trash. "We'll get you something better tomorrow. I don't know what the hell you're supposed to eat, but I doubt processed turkey, is it?" Rex licked his lips once, then sat back down, watching. John sat on the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. The weight of the day was finally sinking in. He had gone from a routine patrol to uncovering a story that was already too big to ignore. Grayson, the Crimson Jackals, a discarded K9 that had survived the streets when he never should have had to. John leaned back, exhaling slowly. "So what now, huh?" Rex just blinked at him. John chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, that makes two of us." The room fell quiet, the distant hum of the city filtering through the thin walls. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Inside, the silence was heavier. After a long moment, Rex moved. He didn't climb onto the couch, didn't try to get close, but he curled up near the door, his body positioned toward it, muscles tense even as exhaustion pulled at him. John frowned. Even in sleep, Rex was keeping watch. John didn't know if that meant Rex still believed in his purpose, or if it meant he didn't trust anyone else to do it. Either way, John wasn't about to let that be the only thing the dog had left. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the storm of thoughts racing through his head. Tomorrow, he'd start digging deeper. He'd find out what really happened to Grayson, to Rex, to whatever had been buried under police records and gang politics. But for now, he let himself rest. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the only one in the room keeping his guard up. The morning came too fast. John woke to the scent of old coffee and the distant sound of traffic. The faintest hint of dawn crept through the curtains, casting muted light against the walls. Rex was already awake. John blinked, sitting up. The dog was exactly where he had been last night, still positioned near the door, ears flicking toward every small sound outside. He looked like he hadn't moved at all. John rubbed the back of his neck. "You sleep at all?" Rex flicked his ears, but he didn't respond. John sighed and got to his feet, stretching out stiff muscles. He padded into the kitchen, grabbing the cold pot of coffee and pouring himself a mug. It was bitter as hell, but it did the job. Rex finally stood, stretching out long limbs before moving toward him. His movements were slow, but not weak. He was recovering, getting his strength back. John watched him. "All right, first order of business, food. Second, we need to figure out what the hell Grayson's been up to." Rex just sat down, waiting. John grabbed his keys, shrugging on his jacket. "Let's go." He didn't know what he was getting into, but as Rex followed him out the door, something in John's gut told him this wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about justice. For both of them, the cold morning air bit at John's skin as he and Rex stepped out of the apartment building. The city was already alive, engines roaring, impatient horns blaring, the weight of Chicago's indifference pressing against the sidewalk cracks. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, glancing down at the dog trotting beside him. Rex moved like a shadow, silent, fluid. His eyes scanning every angle of the street. The dog wasn't just walking, he was working. Even now, even after everything, his instincts were too ingrained to shut off. That realization twisted something in John's gut. He wasn't just some stray. He was a cop, and someone had thrown him away like trash. John tightened his grip on his keys, swallowing down the anger rising in his chest. He couldn't afford to lose his cool, not yet. First, he needed answers. The police station wasn't far, but John drove anyway, not ready to let Rex walk through the streets with him in broad daylight. The Crimson Jackals had eyes everywhere, and even if they weren't actively hunting a discarded K9, they might remember him. The last thing John needed was for word to get back to Grayson before he had a chance to figure out how deep this ran. He pulled into the lot and exhaled. "All right, buddy, you stay here." Rex's ears twitched, but he didn't move to follow. He just stared, unmoving, waiting. John hesitated. He had never known a dog to be so damn quiet. He was used to barking, panting, tail wagging, something that showed a hint of the animal inside. But Rex was pure calculation, all machine and instinct. John shook his head and stepped out, locking the doors behind him. He moved through the station, nodding at a few familiar faces. Most ignored him, too wrapped up in their own messes. It wasn't the place he had dreamed of working. When he first got his badge, he thought he'd be fighting crime, chasing bad guys, making a difference. Instead, he spent most days dealing with paperwork, politics, and the heavy silence of knowing that the system wasn't as clean as he had once believed. He made his way to the records department, flashing his ID at the desk clerk, a tired-looking woman who barely glanced up from her computer. "Morning, Janet," she sighed. "If you're here for another case that isn't yours, McBelt, I swear to God, I just need to look up a name," John cut in. "Won't take long," Janet groaned, rubbing her temple. "What name?" "Martin Grayson." That got her attention. Her fingers froze over the keyboard before she slowly turned her head toward him. "Why are you looking up Grayson?" John leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Because his K9 unit just crawled out of an alley, half-starved, and I want to know why." Janet's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She hesitated, then sighed and started typing. "You know, it's funny. Whenever people around here say they don't want to talk about something, it's usually because they should." I figured as much. The screen flickered, and a list of files popped up. Janet's frown deepened. "This is weird." John peered. "Over the counter." "What?" "His case file's still here, but the internal reports are locked. Even I don't have clearance for them." John's stomach tightened. "Who does?" She clicked a few buttons, then sat back, crossing her arms. "Looks like the only people who can access it are the chief and a handful of upper brass. And, guess what? None of them are here right now?" John clenched his jaw. That wasn't normal. When an officer was dismissed, their files weren't locked away like national secrets. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure no one could dig too deep into Grayson's past. "Can you at least tell me where he was last assigned?" Janet hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Last precinct he worked at before he got booted was the 17th, South Side. Looks like he was partnered with a Sergeant Hawkins for a while." John filed the name away. "Appreciate it, Janet." She sighed. Yeah, just don't get yourself killed." John didn't respond as he turned and walked out. By the time he reached the car, his pulse was pounding. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel for a moment before letting out a slow breath. Rex watched him from the passenger seat, his amber eyes unblinking. John glanced over. "I don't suppose you can tell me what happened, huh?" Rex blinked. John smirked. "Didn't think so." He started the engine and pulled out of the lot. The 17th precinct was a rougher place, the kind of building that looked tired, as if it had spent too many years absorbing the weight of the city's crime. John walked in, immediately catching the scent of stale coffee and sweat. The energy here was different, harsher, more defensive. He spotted Sergeant Hawkins near the back, an older man with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl. John had met him once or twice, but they had never worked together. "Hawkins," John called, walking up. The sergeant barely looked up from his desk. "What do you want?" "Martin Grayson." That got a reaction. Hawkins stiffened slightly before forcing himself to relax. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning John, like he was weighing whether this conversation was worth the trouble. "Why are you asking about Grayson?" John met his gaze head-on. "Because I found his old K9, and I want to know why he was abandoned." Hawkins let out a slow breath, rubbing his face. He was silent for a long moment before shaking his head. "You don't want to go down this road, kid. I think I already have." Hawkins exhaled sharply. Grayson was a damn good cop. Smart, tough, but he got greedy, started working both sides. With the jackals, Hawkins' lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah," John clenched his jaw. "So what happened?" "The department caught wind of something. No one could prove it, but the rumors were enough. They pushed him out before he could drag anyone else down." John frowned. "And Rex?" Hawkins sighed. "That's the thing. When Grayson got dismissed, his dog was supposed to go through proper retirement procedures, but something got messed up in the paperwork. One day he was there, the next he wasn't." John felt his fists clench. "No, not messed up. Grayson had gotten rid of Rex himself." Hawkins shook his head. "If Grayson's still out there, I guarantee you he's not living clean. But if you're smart, you'll let this go." John stood. "Yeah, I don't think I will." He turned and walked out, his mind racing. As he reached his car, Rex perked up, eyes expectant. John ran a hand over his face, exhaling. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Looks like we're not done yet." And for the first time, Rex's tail gave the smallest, almost imperceptible wag. John didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. Grayson wasn't going to like it. John's grip on the wheel was tight as he navigated through Chicago's congested streets. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle that was forming around Grayson, the crimson jackals, and the discarded K9 now sitting silently in his passenger seat. He had spent years trying to believe in the system, trying to convince himself that the badge meant something, that justice still had a place in this city. But every turn he took, every lead he followed, it all led to the same inevitable conclusion. The system was rotten, and Grayson? He wasn't just a symptom of the disease. He had learned how to profit from it. John pulled into his apartment complex, the headlights briefly illuminating the cracked pavement before he killed the engine. Rex remained still, his amber eyes scanning their surroundings before John even reached for the door handle. The dog's instincts were sharp, precise, still functioning as though he was on duty. Maybe, in his own way, he still was. John stepped out, and Rex followed suit. They made their way up the stairs, the old wood creaking under their combined weight. As John reached his door, something shifted in his gut. A feeling, distant but undeniable. Something was wrong. He hesitated, glancing at Rex. The dog was already staring at the door, ears pricked, body low. His muscles were taut, coiled with anticipation. John swallowed, exhaling slowly. He reached for the handle but didn't turn it. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against the wood, feeling for any vibrations, any disturbances. Years on the force had taught him that instincts weren't just paranoia, they were warnings. Carefully, he slid his keys into the lock, twisting slowly. The door creaked open an inch. The apartment was dark, too dark. John knew exactly how he had left the place. The small lamp on the counter should have been on. The faint hum of the fridge should have filled the silence. But the air inside was wrong, stale, thick, humming with something unseen. He took a slow step inside. Rex moved with him, silent, alert, his body language screaming a readiness that made John's pulse quicken. His fingers hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. He had seen enough bad situations go worse because someone panicked too soon. The living room was untouched. The kitchen, the same. It wasn't until he turned toward the hallway leading to the bedroom that his blood ran cold. The door was open. He knew for a fact he had closed it before leaving. John stepped forward, every movement slow, deliberate. Rex stayed close, his breath steady, his eyes locked ahead. John flicked on the light, his stomach clenched. The room hadn't been trashed, nothing had been stolen. But on the bathroom mirror, scrawled in something dark, was a message. "Walk away." The letters dripped, sluggish and uneven. Ink, paint, blood. John wasn't sure, but the meaning was clear. Someone had been inside. Someone had waited for him to find this. Rex let out a low growl, barely audible but full of something primal. John stepped closer, inhaling through his nose. The scent was faint, but there, cigarettes, leather, motor oil. He had spent enough time chasing bikers to recognize the stench immediately. The Crimson Jackals had been here. John's jaw tightened. They weren't just watching, they were warning him. He turned, scanning the room again, looking for anything else. No signs of forced entry, no prints. Whoever had been here knew what they were doing. John took a step back, exhaling slowly. His pulse was steady, but the rage beneath it was building, growing into something deeper. He looked down at Rex. The dog was staring at the message, his body rigid, his breath controlled. John ran a hand over his face. He knew what this meant. They had given him a chance to back off, which meant they thought he might actually do it. That was their mistake. John turned, moving back toward the living room. His hands flexed at his sides, his mind already working through the next step. The Jackals wanted him to walk away. Fine. But first, he was going to make sure they had nowhere left to run. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed. It wasn't someone he had ever thought he would reach out to, but circumstances had changed. The call rang twice before a voice answered, rough and tired. Didn't expect to hear from you, McBelt. John didn't bother with pleasantries. I need information about the Jackals. A pause, then a quiet chuckle. You got a death wish? John's grip on the phone tightened. His eyes flicked toward Rex, who still hadn't moved from his spot. No, John said, his voice firm. But I'm about to give them one. The line went silent, then a sigh. All right, meet me in an hour. The call ended. John slid the phone into his pocket and grabbed his jacket. Rex finally moved, stepping closer, watching him carefully. John knelt, resting a hand on the dog's back. The fur was rough, uneven, still marked by old scars. You still up for this? Rex didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. John exhaled through his nose, nodding once. Good. Because after tonight, there was no turning back. The diner was quiet, the kind of place where the hum of a flickering neon sign was the only background noise between conversations. John sat at the back booth, his fingers drumming against the Formica tabletop, his gaze fixed on the entrance. He hadn't touched his coffee. He wasn't here for the coffee. Rex sat beneath the table, his body curled tight, but his head stayed upright, alert. John had started noticing it more. The way the dog constantly watched his surroundings, the way he positioned himself near exits, the way his breath stayed even despite the tension hanging in the air. A shadow passed by the window, then the door creaked open. The man who stepped inside looked older than John remembered, but not by much. His face was lined, tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled into your bones when you'd been looking over your shoulder for too long. He walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were still sharp, still searching. He spotted John and slid into the booth across from him. You look like hell, the man muttered. John smirked. Right back at you, Carter. Carter nodded, stretching out his legs with a quiet sigh. You got no idea how stupid it is to ask around about the Jackals, right? Now, John leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Then I guess you already know why I'm here. Carter exhaled through his nose. I heard you picked up a stray. John didn't answer. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. Look, man, if you're asking about Grayson, I can tell you what you already know. He was dirty. But if you're asking about what he's doing now, he shook his head. That's where it gets messy. John narrowed his eyes. Messy how? Carter glanced around, then lowered his voice. Messy as in, the Jackals aren't just running drugs anymore. They're expanding. People are scared to talk. And Grayson, he's not just working for them. He's part of their damn backbone now. He's the reason. They're able to move product through the city without getting touched. John clenched his jaw. Carter sighed. I know you, McBelt. You got that stupid do-the-right-thing gene still kicking around in your head, but these guys don't. Play fair. You push them. They push back harder, and they don't go after cops. He looked pointedly at Rex. They go after things cops care about. John's gut twisted, but he didn't let it show. I need to know where Grayson is. Carter hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled a crumpled napkin from his pocket and scribbled something down. He slid it across the table. That's the last place he was seen. You didn't get it from me. John pocketed the napkin. Appreciate it. Carter shook his head. No, you don't. He pushed himself up from the booth. And when this all blows up in your face, don't say I didn't warn you. He walked out without another word. John sat in the silence, the weight of what he had just learned pressing against his chest. Then he felt it, Rex's head pressing lightly against his leg. John exhaled. Yeah, he muttered. I know. They left the diner, stepping into the cold night air. John turned toward his car, reaching for his keys. Then he heard it. A distant sound, barely audible over the city noise. A scream. Rex's ears pricked up first. Then his body tensed, muscles coiling. John didn't hesitate. He ran. His boots pounded against the pavement as he sprinted toward the sound, weaving between cars, his breath controlled but quick. Rex kept pace beside him, silent, focused. The scream had come from an alleyway near the homeless shelter. John turned the corner and froze. The place was wrecked. Shattered glass glistened on the sidewalk. Smoke curled from a dumpster, the flames licking at the side of the building. A man lay on the ground, clutching his ribs, coughing blood. John's stomach turned as he spotted them. 3 men, leather jackets emblazoned with the crimson jackals. Insignia, laughing as they kicked over a box of donated supplies. Another man was gripping a young boy by the collar, shoving him against the brick wall. The kid couldn't have been more than 12. John moved before he had time to think. Hey! The gang members turned. The moment of hesitation cost them. John didn't slow down. His fist connected with the nearest man's jaw, sending him sprawling. The second one reacted faster, swinging at John's ribs. John twisted, letting the hit glance off before slamming an elbow into the guy's throat. He went down hard, gasping for air. The third man reached for something, maybe a knife, maybe a gun, but it didn't matter. Rex moved first. The dog lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's wrist. The scream that followed was pure agony. The weapon clattered to the ground. The man tried to shake Rex off, but the dog held firm, his growl low and deep, a warning from something that had been trained to kill if necessary. The kid scrambled away. His eyes wide with terror, John grabbed the last gang member by the collar, slamming him against the wall. Who sent you? The man spat blood. Screw you, cop! John pressed harder. I won't ask twice. The man grinned, teeth stained red. You think this is bad? This is just the start. You don't walk away, and next time it won't be a damn shelter. It'll be something worse. John's blood ran cold. The man laughed, the sound wet and broken. You really think you can stop this? John didn't answer. He let go, letting the man crumple to the ground. Rex released his grip on the other guy's wrist and stepped back, but his eyes never left him. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called it in. John looked at the wreckage around him, at the broken people, the fire, the chaos. The crimson jackals had sent a message. John clenched his fists. They wanted him to know that no one was safe, but they had made a mistake. Because now John wasn't just looking for justice. Now it was personal. The shelter still smelled like smoke. Even though the fire had been put out, the damage was done. The windows were shattered, the supplies scattered, and the people who had called this place a temporary home were left standing in the cold, fear etched into their faces. John stood near the curb, watching as the paramedics checked over the injured. The kid, still shaking, was wrapped in a thermal blanket, his eyes distant. The older man who had been beaten lay on a stretcher, his fingers stained red from the blood on his ribs. The cops who had arrived were doing what cops always did in a city like this, writing reports, making empty promises, pretending this would all be fixed with a few arrests. But John knew better. The jackals wouldn't stop. This wasn't a warning. This was their way of showing that they could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and that wasn't something John could let stand. He felt Rex at his side, the dog still on high alert, his body tense, his head snapping toward every sudden movement. He had felt it too, the shift in the air, the weight of something bigger coming. John pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found the name he was looking for and hit call. The line rang once, twice, before a deep voice answered. "McBelt," John exhaled. "I need a favor." There was a pause. "This about the jackals." John didn't answer. He didn't have to. The voice on the other end sighed. "Where are you?" John looked at the ruined shelter. "South side, near Ashland. Meet me in an hour and bring the dog." The call ended. John pocketed his phone and turned to Rex. "Looks like we're making new friends." Rex didn't react, but his ears flicked slightly. John had a feeling the dog understood more than he let on. They left the shelter behind and drove in silence. The streets felt heavier now, the weight of the city pressing against the windshield. The jackals had sent a message, and John was about to send one back. He pulled into a small lot behind an abandoned warehouse, the kind of place that looked like it had been forgotten by time. But it wasn't abandoned. John stepped out, Rex following, close behind, and walked toward the entrance. The door was unmarked, but he knew he was in the right place when it cracked open slightly, just enough for a pair of eyes to look him over. Then the door swung open. The man waiting inside was built like a tank, his arms thick with muscle, his face lined with scars. He wasn't a cop. Not anymore, but once, a long time ago, he had been one of the good ones. "McBelt," the man said, crossing his arms. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you." John shrugged. "I didn't think I'd need to call." The man glanced at Rex, his brows raising slightly. "That him?" John nodded. "Yeah." The man crouched slightly, extending a hand toward Rex, but not touching him. "Hell of a dog." Rex didn't move at first. Then slowly, he leaned forward, sniffed, and let the man scratch behind his ears. John crossed his arms. "You still keeping an eye on things?" The man stood. "I don't wear the badge anymore, but I know what happens in my city." He studied John for a long moment. "You really want to go after them?" They went after a homeless shelter. The man exhaled. "Yeah, I heard." John stepped closer. "I need names. I need places. I need to know who's running things now." The man hesitated. Then he gestured for John to follow. They walked deeper into the warehouse, where old desks were covered in maps, documents, and photos. It looked like an unofficial investigation board, pieced together by someone who hadn't let retirement stop him from doing what needed to be done. "They've changed," the man muttered, flipping through a few papers. "It's not just about drugs anymore. They're moving weapons now, real firepower. And Grayson, he's the one making sure nothing gets traced back to them." John's jaw clenched. "Where is he?" The man shook his head. "Not sure, but I know where they meet." He tapped the map. "Old warehouse near the river. They use it to move shipments. If you want to start shaking the tree, that's the place to do it." John studied the map. It was risky, but if Grayson was still operating under the radar, this was the best shot he had. He turned to the man. "You in?" The man let out a low chuckle. "I'm too old for this, McBelt," John smirked. "Yeah, me too." The man hesitated. Then he grabbed his jacket. "Screw it, let's make some noise." They left the warehouse, moving like ghosts through the city, slipping into the underbelly where the real war was being fought. John didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing. This time, he wasn't walking in alone. The city blurred past in a haze of neon and shadow as John drove, his fingers gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. The warehouse Carter had pointed him toward sat near the river, tucked away in the industrial district where no one asked questions, and the cops who did were already paid off. Rex sat beside him, silent, his head low but his eyes sharp. He hadn't relaxed since the shelter attack. Maybe he never did. John understood that feeling all too well. Carter rode behind them on his old bike, a ghost from another life. John hadn't seen him in years, but the man hadn't changed. Still, broad-shouldered, still moving like a man who knew the weight of every mistake he'd ever made. John glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "You sure you want to do this?" Carter smirked. "Didn't come out here for the scenery." John exhaled. "All right then." He pulled off the road, killing the engine as they approached the warehouse. The place looked abandoned. But John knew better. The jackals weren't the type to leave their operations unguarded. Carter parked his bike a few yards away, stepping off and cracking his knuckles. "So what's the play?" John reached for his holster, checking his gun, before nodding toward the building. "We go in quiet, find out if Grayson's inside. If he is, we bring him in." Carter snorted. "You still think this is about bringing someone in?" John didn't answer. Carter sighed. "Didn't think so." They moved forward, sticking to the shadows. The night air smelled like oil and rust, the river's scent thick in the background. Rex moved like a shadow, his steps barely making a sound against the cracked pavement. John reached the side door and tested the handle. Locked. Carter pulled a knife from his pocket and started working on it. "Give me a sec." John scanned the area, his gut tightening. Something felt off, too quiet, too easy. The lock clicked, and Carter eased the door open. John stepped inside first, gun drawn. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of gasoline and metal. Wooden crates were stacked against the far wall, some open, revealing automatic rifles packed in tight rows. Weapons, just like Carter had said. Rex's body tensed beside him. Carter let out a low whistle. "Looks like they're gearing up for something big." John nodded, stepping forward. His ears strained for any movement, any sign that they weren't alone. Then he heard it, a soft click. John's heart slammed against his ribs as he spun, but it was too late. The overhead lights blazed to life, blinding white. The sound of cocking. Guns echoed through the space. John cursed under his breath. They had walked right into it. Figures emerged from the shadows. Jackals, a dozen at least, all armed. A few had bats, others had knives, but most carried guns, and then, stepping through the crowd with the confidence of a man who knew he had already won, was Martin Grayson. John felt his blood turn to ice. Grayson smirked. Well, I was wondering when you'd come sniffing around, McBelt." John kept his gun raised, but he knew it was pointless. They were surrounded. Carter let out a low chuckle. "Damn, hate being right." Grayson tilted his head. "You always were a stubborn one, McBelt. Thought you'd have learned by now that there are fights you can't win." John's jaw tightened. "You working for them now, Grayson?" Grayson grinned. "Not for them, with them." John exhaled. "You always were a piece of shit." Grayson chuckled, unbothered. "And you always were too righteous for your own." "In good." He glanced down at Rex. "I see you found my old dog." Something dark flickered in his eyes. "You know, I always wondered if he'd make it out there. Looks like he did." Rex stood perfectly still, but his eyes were locked onto Grayson, unblinking. John's grip tightened on his gun. "Why?" Grayson shrugged. He wasn't useful anymore. The casualness of the words made John's fingers twitch. Grayson smirked. "Relax, it's not like I put a bullet in him." John felt Carter shift slightly beside him. They weren't walking out of this. Not unless they did something fast. Grayson sighed. "I could kill you right now, but that would be messy, and I don't like messy." He nodded toward one of his men. "Take their weapons. Make sure they leave here understanding that this is the last time they come sniffing around." John didn't wait. He moved. His elbow slammed into the nearest biker's face, sending the man reeling. Gunfire erupted as chaos exploded around them. Rex lunged, his teeth sinking into a man's arm, dragging him down. John ducked as a bullet whizzed past his ear. He grabbed a nearby crate and flipped it over, sending rifles scattering across the floor. Carter had already grabbed one, firing off shots as the bikers scrambled for cover. Grayson was gone. He had slipped into the shadows the second things went sideways. John gritted his teeth. He would deal with him later. Right now they had to get out. He grabbed Rex's collar, pulling him back. Time to go! Carter covered them as they sprinted for the exit. Bullets slammed into the walls, sparks flying. John crashed through the side door, stumbling into the night air. Carter was right behind him. The bikers weren't following, not yet. But John knew this wasn't over. They had just declared war. He turned to Carter. "You good?" Carter wiped blood from his lip. "Define good," John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Rex stood beside him, breathing heavy but unhurt. John looked down at him. "You all right?" Rex stared back. John swore he saw something in those eyes, something sharp, something determined. John turned back to Carter. "We need to move, now." Carter nodded. "Yeah, and you need to understand something, McBelt." John raised a brow. Carter wiped more blood from his face and sighed. "They aren't just going to let this go." John glanced back at the warehouse, at the gang regrouping inside. "I know," he muttered, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready for it. John drove fast, weaving through the empty streets, his grip tight on the wheel. The warehouse had been a trap. They had walked straight into it, and if not for the chaos that erupted in the moment, they would be dead or worse. Just another couple of names in a missing persons report that would never be investigated. Carter sat beside him, a cut on his lip drying. His knuckles raw from the fight. He was breathing heavy, like a man who had just gotten a taste of death and wasn't quite sure how to process it. Rex lay in the back seat, his chest rising and falling in controlled breaths, his body tense, ears flicking with every shift in the road. He hadn't let his guard down once. John glanced at Carter. "You still think I should have walked away?" Carter let out a bitter chuckle. "Wouldn't matter. They were always going to come for you." John tightened his grip. "Then we hit. Back first." Carter turned his head, studying him. "You really think this is just about Grayson?" John didn't answer, because deep down, he knew it wasn't. This wasn't just about a crooked ex-cop who had sold his soul to a gang. This was bigger, something darker. The weapons, the growing network, the way the jackals were expanding beyond drugs and into something more dangerous. And somehow, Rex was at the center of it. John pulled into a small lot near an abandoned gas station, cutting the engine. It wasn't safe to go home, not yet. They needed a plan. He turned in his seat, looking at Carter. "You said they've changed, that they're bigger now. What the hell are they into?" Carter exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "You're not gonna like it." John leaned forward. "Try me." Carter hesitated, then shook his head. "It's not just weapons. They're moving bodies too." John's stomach turned. "Human trafficking?" Carter nodded grimly. "Kids, runaways, women who thought they were getting a second chance." He exhaled sharply. "And the worst part, they don't just sell. Them. Some don't even make it to the buyers." John felt his pulse hammer against his skull. "What the hell does that mean?" Carter looked away, jaw tight. "It means there's a goddamn pit somewhere, a place where people get sent when they're no longer useful, and no one comes back from it." John felt a cold wave settle over him. His eyes drifted to Rex, lying in the back seat, silent, waiting, and suddenly it all made sense. Rex had been abandoned. No records, no official decommissioning. Grayson had gotten rid of him, not because he was useless, but because he had seen something. John swallowed hard. "Where?" Carter hesitated. "I don't know, but I know someone who might." John was already starting the car. "Then let's go." Carter didn't argue. They drove through the city, the streetlights flashing past like ghosts. John didn't know where this was going to end. But he knew one thing for sure. If the jackals had built a place where people disappeared, he was going to burn it to the ground. They arrived at a rundown auto shop on the outskirts of town, a place where even the streetlights refused to shine. Carter led the way, knocking twice on the dented metal door before stepping back. The door cracked open, and a pair of wary eyes peered out. Then, with a heavy sigh, the door swung inward, revealing a man in grease-stained coveralls, his face lined with exhaustion. What the hell are you doing here, Carter? Carter glanced at John. We need information. The man scoffed. You always need something. John stepped forward. The jackals, the pit, where is it? The man stiffened. His eyes flicked to Rex, then back to John. I don't know what you're talking about. John clenched his jaw. You do. The man hesitated, his fingers twitching. Even if I did, talking about it is a death sentence. Carter sighed. You know what's worse? Living with it. The man swallowed hard. Then finally he spoke. Old slaughterhouse, he muttered. Outside the city. That's where they take the ones who don't make it to the buyers. John's stomach twisted. And the ones that do? The man exhaled, shakily. They don't last long. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. John nodded once. Thanks. The man looked at Rex again. He came from there, didn't he? John didn't answer. The man shook his head. Then you already know what kind of people you're dealing with. John turned, walking back to the car. Carter followed, his expression unreadable. You really gonna do this? John opened the driver's side door, looking back at Rex, who had already climbed in, waiting. We all got a job to do. Carter sighed, rubbing his face. This is gonna get ugly. John slid behind the wheel. Then let's make sure we hit first. The slaughterhouse sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by overgrown fields and rusted fences. The air smelled of old blood and decay, a place where death had settled in and never left. John parked a good distance away, cutting the lights. The place was quiet but not empty. He could see the faint glow of security cameras, the occasional shadow moving. Behind the broken windows, Rex was already staring ahead, his body tense. He knew this place. John reached into the back seat, grabbing his gun, checking the clip. Carter did the same. No backup, Carter muttered. John smirked. You volunteering? Carter shook his head. Hell no. Just wondering. How stupid we are, John exhaled. Smart enough to know we can't walk away from this. Carter muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue. John looked at Rex. You ready? The dog's ears perked, his muscles coiled. John opened the door, stepping out into the night. They moved quickly, keeping low. The front was too obvious, so they circled around, finding a rusted side door. John tested the handle. Unlocked, he pushed it open, stepping inside. The air was thick with rot. The walls were lined with old meat hooks, some rusted, some still stained. In the distance he could hear something. Voices, then a scream. John didn't hesitate. He moved, gun up, heart pounding. They reached a stairwell leading down. Carter swore under his breath. You sure about this? John nodded. They descended. The basement was worse. Dark. Cold, the walls lined with cages. Some empty, some not. John's stomach twisted as he saw them, people barely conscious, barely breathing, and then footsteps, more jackals. John didn't wait. The first shot rang out, echoing through the concrete halls. Rex lunged, Carter fired, and in that moment, John knew. This wasn't just another raid, this was war, and he wasn't leaving until the jackals were buried in the dirt. The sound of the first gunshot shattered the silence like breaking glass. John barely had time to process. Before the whole room erupted into chaos. The jackals weren't expecting them, not here, not now, but surprise only bought so much time. A second shot cracked through the air. Carter's aim true, dropping a man before he could reach for his weapon. Another figure lunged from the shadows, a blade flashing in the dim light, but Rex was faster. The dog's growl cut through the noise as he clamped down on the attacker's arm, dragging him down with a sickening crunch. John moved fast, his instincts taking over. He fired at another figure in the doorway, the impact sending the man staggering backward. The hallway beyond was alive with movement, footsteps, shouting, the unmistakable sound of weapons being loaded. They were outnumbered. John exhaled sharply. No time to think about that. He moved toward the cages, his breath tight in his throat. The stench of fear and filth was thick, clinging to the cold concrete walls. Some of the people inside were barely moving, their faces hollowed out by exhaustion and hopelessness. Others flinched at every noise, their eyes darting wildly between John and the bodies on the floor. "We're getting you out of here," John called, his voice firm, steady. He reached for the nearest cage, testing the lock. Heavy steel. No time to pick it. He pulled back and fired. The lock shattered, the door creaking open. A woman inside hesitated before stumbling forward, her hands shaking. John caught her before she fell. "You're all right," he told her. "You're all right." Carter was already moving, unlocking another cage. "We need to move, McBelt. They'll regroup fast," John nodded. He turned to Rex, who stood over the downed attacker, blood staining his muzzle. The dog didn't look away from the hallway, his ears twitching at the approaching footsteps. More jackals. John clenched his jaw. "Carter, get them out! Now!" Carter swore under his breath but nodded, guiding the freed captives toward the stairs. "What about you?" John's grip on his gun tightened. "I'm ending this." Carter didn't argue. He knew better. Try not to die. Then he was gone, disappearing up the stairs with the others. John turned back toward the hallway. Just as the first jackal appeared, Grayson, the ex-cop, stood at the far end of the corridor, his gun drawn, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Well, shit," Grayson drawled, his voice thick with amusement. "Didn't think you had it in you, McBelt." John didn't lower his gun. "You're done, Grayson." Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a real piece of work, you know that? Always so damn righteous, like you're any different from the rest of us." John took a step forward. "I don't sell people." Grayson's smirk faltered just slightly. Then with a slow shrug, he lifted his gun. "Guess we're doing this the hard way." John didn't wait. He fired first. Grayson dove aside, the bullet slamming into the concrete wall behind him. The hallway exploded into movement as more jackals poured in from the side doors, their guns flashing in the dim light. John ducked, rolling, behind an overturned crate. Bullets ripped through the air, sending shards of debris flying. Rex moved like a ghost, dodging between cover, his body low to the ground, waiting for the right moment to strike. John reloaded, breathing hard. He could hear Grayson laughing from the shadows. "You know, I should have put a bullet in that dog when I had the chance." John's vision blurred with rage. Rex's growl rumbled low in his throat. Grayson stepped into view again, his gun raised. "Last chance, McBelt. Walk away. No one will blame you." John exhaled, steadying his aim. "Yeah?" Then he fired. The bullet grazed Grayson's shoulder, spinning him sideways. He let out a sharp curse, clutching at the wound. John moved. He tackled Grayson before the man could recover, slamming him against the wall. The gun fell from his grip, skidding across the floor. Grayson snarled, swinging a punch. John blocked it, driving his knee into the man's ribs. Grayson staggered, but he didn't fall. He grinned, blood staining his teeth. "That all you got?" John didn't answer. He just hit him again. This time, Grayson went down. John stood over him, breathing hard. His knuckles ached, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Grayson groaned, rolling onto his back. His hand twitched toward his ankle, reaching for a knife. But before he could grab it, Rex lunged. The dog's teeth sank into Grayson's arm, pinning him to the ground. Grayson let out a ragged scream. John stepped forward, pressing his boot against Grayson's chest. "You're done," he said, his voice low, final. Grayson spat blood. "You think this ends with me?" John met his gaze, unflinching. "Yeah." Then he swung. The punch landed hard, knocking Grayson out cold. John exhaled, stepping back. His entire body felt like it was running on fumes, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. Rex released his grip, stepping back, his breath even, controlled. John knelt beside Grayson, patting him down. He found a burner phone in the man's pocket. He flipped it open. Recent messages, calls, names, a full network. John's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a gang. This was an operation. He turned to Rex. The dog sat quietly, waiting, as if he already knew what John was thinking. "This isn't over," John muttered. Rex didn't move, because he knew. Neither of them were walking away from this fight. Not until it was finished. John shoved Grayson's unconscious body against the nearest wall, securing his wrists with the plastic zip ties he had pulled from his back pocket. The ex-cop was bleeding from his nose, his head lolling slightly to the side as his chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. He'd live, but he wasn't walking away from this. Rex sat at John's side, his breathing steady, his amber eyes locked onto Grayson's face, as if waiting for him to make a wrong move. Blood still stained the fur around his muzzle, a stark reminder of just how close Grayson had come to dying tonight. John wiped the sweat from his forehead, taking a moment to let the adrenaline settle. The gunfight had torn through the slaughterhouse, bodies lying sprawled across the concrete floor, blood pooling into old drainage grates. Carter had gotten the hostages out, but the jackals had sent a message loud and clear. This wasn't just a street gang anymore. This was something bigger. John pulled out the burner phone he had lifted off Grayson, flipping through the messages, names, drop locations, financial records that ran deeper than he had expected. This wasn't just about weapons. This was about money laundering, corruption, an entire network of crime operating right under the city's nose. And the cops wouldn't do a damn thing about it. Grayson groaned, his eyelids fluttering as he started to come to. John crouched in front of him, gripping his chin, forcing him to look up. "Welcome back," John muttered. Grayson's lip curled, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite fear. It was worse. Acceptance. Like he had known this was coming, like he had been expecting it for a long time. "You think this changes anything?" Grayson rasped, voice rough from the fight. John tightened his grip. "I think this puts you exactly where you belong." Grayson chuckled, coughing on his own blood. "And where's that? Prison?" He shook his head, smirking through the pain. "You think that place scares me?" John's jaw clenched. "You're playing checkers," Grayson continued. "These guys, they're playing chess. You take me down, someone else fills my seat. Hell, I'll probably be back on the street before your shift is over." John let go of his chin and stood up, pacing for a moment. He wanted to believe Grayson was bluffing. He wanted to believe that dragging him in would be enough. But he knew better. Carter's words echoed in his mind. "They don't just run drugs anymore." John exhaled sharply. He wasn't about to let this cycle continue. He turned back to Grayson. "Where's the next drop?" Grayson tilted his head. "Why should I tell you?" John didn't hesitate. He grabbed Grayson by the collar and slammed him back against the wall, hard enough to make the bastard grunt. "You really think I'm walking out of here without that information?" John's voice was dangerously low, his fingers tightening. Grayson laughed again, but there was less certainty behind it now. "You wouldn't kill me," John leaned in. "Wouldn't I?" Rex let out a low growl beside him, his teeth flashing. Under the dim light, Grayson swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. All right. His smirk faded, replaced with something closer to exhaustion. "Warehouse, docks, 2 nights from now, big shipment." John didn't let go immediately, waiting, watching his eyes. He was telling the truth. He released. Him stepping back. Grayson slumped, flexing his tied wrists. "You got what you wanted, now what?" John considered his options. He could call it in, drop Grayson off at the precinct and let internal affairs sort through the mess. But then what? He'd be processed, sure, but if the jackals had their hooks deep enough, he'd be back on the street within weeks, if not days. No, that wasn't good enough. John grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "You better have a damn good reason for calling me." John smirked. "Nice to hear your voice too, Chief." There was a pause. "You in trouble?" "Depends on how you look at it." John glanced down at Grayson. "Got a package for you, one that needs to disappear for a while." The chief sighed heavily. "McBelt, I can't just—" "I'm not asking for favors," John cut in. "I'm asking for time. You want to get these bastards. You need to keep him off the board until we make our move." Silence. Then finally, "Where are you?" John gave him the address. "You owe me for this," the chief muttered before hanging up. John pocketed the phone and turned back to Grayson. "Guess you're going for a little trip." Grayson scoffed. "You think one cop can stop all of this?" John tilted his head. "Who said I was alone?" Carter pulled up a minute later in an old sedan, its headlights flickering slightly. He stepped out, glancing at the scene. "This him?" John nodded. Carter whistled. "Damn. Thought he'd put up more of a fight." "He did." Carter opened the back door. "All right, let's get this over with." John hauled Grayson to his feet and shoved him toward the car. The ex-cop didn't fight it. Maybe he knew there was no point. Rex watched silently, his ears twitching. As Grayson was shoved into the back seat, John met Carter's gaze. "Get him there safe," Carter smirked. "What, you don't trust me?" John smirked back. "Not even a little," Carter chuckled, sliding into the driver's seat. "See you at the docks." John nodded as the car pulled away, disappearing into the night. Then, finally, the silence settled. He looked down at Rex. The dog sat beside him, breathing steady, waiting. John let out a slow breath. "One more move, buddy." Rex didn't react, but something in his eyes told John he understood. The game wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The docks were quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. This was the kind that hummed with anticipation. The kind that made John's skin prickle under the cold night air. The wind carried the scent of salt and rusted metal, waves lapping against the wooden piers, masking the distant murmurs of men who thought they were untouchable. John crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, watching the figures moving near the warehouse. He counted at least 12 men, maybe more inside. Some were armed with pistols, others with heavier firepower slung over their shoulders like they had nothing to fear. The jackals weren't just making a move, they were staking their claim, preparing for something bigger than just another shipment. Rex was tense beside him, low to the ground, his breath slow and steady. The dog was watching them the same way John was, calculating, waiting for the moment to strike. Carter was a few yards away, hidden behind another crate, his pistol drawn but held close to his side. He had agreed to back John up, but not without. "Complaints, this is stupid," Carter had muttered when they were planning. "Even for you." "Probably," John had admitted, "but I don't see another option." Now, with the reality of the situation staring him down, he felt the weight of those words. There was no going back. A black SUV rolled up to the warehouse, its tires crunching against the gravel. The moment it stopped, the side door swung open, and John saw him. Grayson. He stepped out slowly, taking his time, stretching like he had just woken up from a long nap. He wore the same smirk as always, that smug, self-assured grin that made John's fingers itch to break his jaw. A second figure followed, someone John didn't recognize, tall, broad, with the kind of presence that made people step aside without being asked. Carter shifted slightly. "That's their new supplier," John frowned. "Who is he?" Carter exhaled. "No name anyone's willing to say out loud. But the word is, he's not just moving weapons, he's moving people." John's grip tightened on his gun. The supplier handed Grayson a duffel bag. Grayson unzipped it, checked the contents, then nodded. The exchange was quick, efficient. These guys had done this before. Then Grayson spoke. "Pleasure doing business." The supplier gave a short nod, then turned back toward his SUV. John's jaw clenched. He could take out Grayson right now. One clean shot and this nightmare would be over, but it wouldn't stop anything. The supplier would keep running things. The jackals would keep growing. And worst of all, the people trapped in their network, the ones being moved like cargo, would stay missing. John couldn't let that happen. He exhaled slowly. "Wait for my signal," he murmured. Carter scoffed. "I really hate it when you say that." John ignored him, stepping out of cover. "Grayson." The moment his voice carried across the docks, every gun turned in his direction. Grayson, however, just grinned. Well, he turned slowly, hands in his pockets. "You really don't know when to quit, do you, McBelt?" John kept walking, his gun steady in his grip. "You're done," Grayson chuckled. "That so?" He nodded toward the men behind him. "'Cause from where I'm standing, it looks like you just walked into your own funeral." John heard Carter mutter a curse under his breath. Grayson tilted his head. "Tell me something, John. Do you even know what you're doing?" You think you're some kind of hero? John ignored the bait. Last chance, Grayson. Stand down. Grayson sighed dramatically, shaking his head. You really are an idiot. Then he nodded, and everything exploded. Gunfire erupted from both sides, bullets ricocheting off metal containers. John dove for cover, rolling behind a stack of wooden crates. Carter fired back, his shots sharp and controlled, dropping the first jackal who tried to advance. Rex didn't wait. The dog moved like lightning, weaving through the chaos, lunging at the nearest gunman. He took the man down in an instant, his growl lost in the storm of gunfire. John popped up, squeezing off 3 quick shots. Another jackal went down, clutching his leg, howling in pain. Grayson had already started moving, ducking behind a truck. Barking orders to his men, John had one goal: get to him. He moved fast, dodging behind cover, Carter laying down fire as he advanced. The supplier was gone. John barely caught a glimpse of his SUV peeling away before he disappeared into the night. Coward. But Grayson was still here. John reached the truck. Just as Grayson stepped out, gun raised, they fired at the same time. John's shoulder jerked back as the bullet grazed him, burning hot against his skin. But Grayson wasn't as lucky. John's shot caught him in the leg, sending him staggering. He didn't go down, though. Instead, he laughed. You really think this matters? Grayson coughed, gripping his bleeding leg. Even if you take me down, someone else will step in. You can't stop this. John lowered his gun, breathing hard. Watch me! Then he lunged. Grayson swung first, but John was ready. He caught his wrist, twisting it hard until the gun clattered to the ground. Then he drove his fist into Grayson's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Grayson gasped, stumbling back. But he wasn't done. He reached into his jacket, pulling a knife. John barely dodged the first swing, feeling the blade slice the air near his throat. The second came faster, but he deflected it, grabbing Grayson's wrist, twisting. A sharp yelp split the air. Grayson barely had time to react before Rex was on him. The dog clamped his jaws around Grayson's forearm, shaking violently. The knife clattered to the ground. Grayson screamed. John didn't stop him. Rex had earned this. Grayson tried to pull free, but Rex didn't let go. The ex-cop's screams turned hoarse, his body twisting as he fell to the ground. John stepped forward, placing a boot against his chest. Grayson's breaths were ragged, his body shaking. "Call them off!" John ordered. Grayson gritted his teeth, but John pressed harder. "Call them off!" Grayson let out a sharp whistle. The remaining jackals hesitated. Then, slowly, they started backing away. John exhaled. It was over. Rex finally released his grip, stepping back, his fur bristling but his breathing even. John knelt beside Grayson. "You were right about one thing," he murmured. "Someone will take your place." Grayson let out a weak chuckle. "Then why bother?" John's expression hardened. "Because people like you don't get to win." Carter stepped up behind him. "Cops are coming. What do we do with him?" John stood. "Let them have him," Carter smirked. "That easy?" John looked down at Rex, then back at Grayson. "Nothing about this was easy." Sirens wailed in the distance. For the first time in years, John felt like he could breathe. Rex sat beside him, his tail flicking once, and just like that, it was over. Or maybe, just maybe, it was only the beginning. The sirens grew louder, bouncing off the cold steel of the shipping containers, painting the docks in red and blue flashes. Grayson lay on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his blood mixing with the dirt and oil-stained pavement. His leg wound was still bleeding, but not enough to kill him. Not enough to let him escape this time. John took a step back, the weight of everything crashing down on him. His arms felt heavy, his muscles stiff from the fight, his shoulder throbbing from the bullet that had grazed him. He ignored it. There was too much to do, too much to think about. Carter stood a few feet away, wiping blood from his lip, shaking his head. "We just threw a grenade into a hornet's nest." John exhaled slowly. "We had to," Carter chuckled bitterly. "Yeah, but I don't think they're just going to let this slide." John looked down at Rex. The dog was still standing, still breathing steady, but his eyes hadn't moved from Grayson. It was like he was waiting to see if the man would try to crawl away, to slip into the darkness again. But there was nowhere left to go. The first patrol car screeched to a halt, its tires kicking up dust and gravel. Doors flew open, boots hit the ground. Officers swarmed in, their weapons drawn, their voices sharp. "Drop your weapon! Hands where we can see them!" John slowly raised his hands, nodding toward his gun on the ground. "It's over." One of the officers hesitated when he recognized him. "McBelt?" John nodded. "Yeah." Another officer, younger, less sure, stepped forward. "You mind telling us what the hell is going on here?" John glanced at Grayson. "Ask him." The officers moved in, securing the ex-cop, patting him down. Grayson let out a weak, breathless chuckle. "You think this changes anything?" he muttered, just loud enough for John to hear. "You think the jackals are done?" John stared at him for a long moment, then crouched down. "No," he said quietly, "but you are." Grayson's smirk faltered. John stood as the officers lifted him, dragging him toward one of the squad cars. They'd process him, book him, throw him into a holding cell, but John knew it wouldn't be that simple. The jackals still had power. They still had reach. Grayson might be out of the game for now, but he had left behind something bigger. Something that wouldn't die just because he was wearing cuffs. One of the senior officers approached John, his brow furrowed. "We'll need statements." John nodded. "Yeah, but you better call in the feds." The officer frowned. "Why?" John looked at the warehouse, at the crates full of weapons, at the network of corruption that had seeped into the city like poison. "Because this isn't just a gang problem," he said. "It's bigger than that." The officer exhaled sharply, but nodded, pulling out his radio. John turned to Carter. "You good?" Carter smirked. "Define good." John let out a tired breath. "We're not done." Carter rolled his shoulders. "Didn't think we were." John looked down at Rex. The dog was still watching everything, still analyzing. He knelt down, running a hand through the thick fur on the back of Rex's neck. "We did good tonight." Rex's ears flicked, his tail giving a small, almost imperceptible wag. John let his hand drop. "Let's go home." The drive back to his apartment was quiet. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by exhaustion so deep it settled into his bones. He wasn't even sure what home meant anymore, but for now it was four walls and a place to breathe. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his eyes half-lidded, but still alert. John wondered if the dog ever really slept. When they reached the apartment, John didn't bother turning on the lights. He locked the door behind them, then collapsed onto the couch, exhaling sharply. Rex stood in the doorway watching him. John smirked. "You gonna just stand there all night?" Rex hesitated, then slowly he moved toward him. He didn't jump onto the couch, didn't invade John's space, but he sat close, closer than before. John took that as a win. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He groaned, pulling it out, already knowing who it was. He answered. "Yeah." Carter's voice was quiet. "You get some sleep?" John scoffed. "You?" Carter chuckled. "Didn't think so." A pause. "You were right, by the way." John frowned. "About what?" Carter sighed. "It's bigger than he thought. The jackals aren't just a gang anymore. They've got politicians, cops, people in places that make them damn near untouchable." John rubbed his temples. "So what's our next move?" Carter hesitated. "We don't have one." John sat up. "The hell we don't," Carter exhaled. "McBelt, we started a war tonight. We just took out one man, but there's an army behind him." John clenched his jaw. "Then we take out the army." Carter let out a quiet laugh. "You always were a stubborn bastard." John didn't answer. Carter sighed again. "I'll be in touch." The line went dead. John tossed the phone onto the table, leaning back against the couch. Rex was still watching him. John smirked. "What?" The dog blinked. John sighed. "Yeah, I know. They weren't done. Not even close. But for tonight, just for tonight, they could rest. John woke up to the sound of scratching. His hand instinctively went to his gun, but the tension eased when his mind caught up. It wasn't someone breaking in. It was Rex, standing by the door, his claws lightly tapping against the wood. The room was still dark, the city outside barely stirring. John checked his phone, 4:32 a.m. He groaned, rubbing his face. "You're kidding me." Rex didn't move, didn't so much as flick an ear. He just stared, waiting. John sighed. "All right, fine." He pushed himself off the couch, stretching out the stiffness in his back, then grabbed his jacket. The air outside was crisp, cool enough that John could see his breath as he locked the door behind them. The streets were empty except for the occasional passing car, headlights slicing through the early morning fog. Rex moved with purpose, nose to the ground, his body relaxed but aware. It was different from before. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was settling into something new. John shoved his hands into his pockets, walking beside him. "You ever gonna just enjoy a walk? Or is everything a mission with you?" Rex glanced up at him, then looked forward again. John smirked. "Yeah, that's what I thought." They walked for a while, the silence comfortable. John let his mind wander, let himself breathe. It had been a long time since he had felt this way, like he wasn't completely alone. Rex suddenly stopped, his body going still. John froze. "What is it?" Rex's ears flicked, nose twitching. Then, just as quickly, he relaxed. John followed. His gaze. Across the street, near an alley, a homeless man sat against a dumpster, wrapped in layers of old clothing, his face barely visible beneath the hood of his tattered coat. His breath came out in small clouds, slow, steady. Rex didn't bark, didn't growl. He just watched. John exhaled. "Yeah, buddy, I see him." He glanced around, then crossed the street. Rex followed, staying close. The man stirred slightly when John crouched beside him. His eyes were tired but still sharp. He looked at Rex, then at John. "Ain't got nothing worth taking, officer." John shook his head. "Not here for that." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded 20. "Get yourself some food." The man hesitated. "What's the catch?" John smirked. "No catch, just don't let it go to waste." The man took the bill slowly, his fingers rough and calloused. He looked at Rex again. "Good dog." John glanced at Rex, watching the way the dog stood, unmoving, patient. "Yeah, he is." They left the man behind, heading back toward the apartment. John hadn't realized it yet, but something had shifted. Rex wasn't just following anymore. He was walking beside him. Back at the apartment, John pulled out the bag of dog food he had picked up earlier and poured some into a bowl. Rex sat nearby, watching, waiting. John chuckled. "You can eat, you know." Rex didn't move until John stepped back. Only then did he approach the bowl, lowering his head to eat. John shook his head, leaning against the counter. "You really don't trust anyone, huh?" Rex kept eating. John ran a hand through his hair, letting out a breath. "Yeah, I get it." His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Carter, John picked up. "You got something?" Carter's voice was tight. "Yeah, but you're not gonna like it." John straightened. "What happened?" Carter hesitated. "Then, they're not letting this go, McBelt. You knew that, right?" John clenched his jaw. "What did you hear?" Carter sighed. "Word on the street is someone higher up wants you handled. Not the jackals. Someone bigger." John frowned. "Bigger how?" "You ever hear of a guy named Vance?" John stiffened. Yeah, he had heard the name before. Vance wasn't just a criminal. He was a businessman. The kind who never got his hands dirty, never showed up in the reports, but was always there pulling the strings. John had spent years trying to nail guys like him, and now he had their attention. Carter's voice was quieter now. "Look, man, you rattled the cage. You put Grayson in cuffs, but he was just a symptom. You think Vance gives a damn about some dirty ex-cop?" John exhaled slowly. "No, he cares about what you might do next." John glanced at Rex. The dog had finished eating and was now sitting near the door, waiting again, like he knew, like he understood. John rubbed the back of his neck. "What do you think they're gonna do?" Carter hesitated. "If I were you, I'd start watching my back." John smirked. "I always do." Carter let out a tired chuckle. "Yeah, That's what worries me. The call ended. John leaned against the counter, letting the weight of it all settle. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Rex let out a quiet huff, like he was tired of waiting. John nodded. All right, I hear you." He grabbed his jacket and holstered his gun, then he opened the door. Rex didn't hesitate. He walked through first, and for the first time, John realized this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was war, and they weren't fighting it alone. The night was cold, but John barely felt it. The weight of everything that had happened sat heavier on his shoulders than the chill in the air. The city pulsed around him, headlights flashing across his windshield, distant sirens wailing like ghosts in the wind. It wasn't over. It wasn't even close. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his body tense, ears flicking at every passing noise. He hadn't relaxed since they left the apartment, and neither had John. Carter's warning played over and over in his head. Someone bigger wants. You handled, not the jackals. John clenched the steering wheel, his jaw tight. He had spent years dealing with small-time criminals, lowlifes who thought they owned the streets. But Vance was different. He wasn't just another gang leader. He was the kind of man who could make problems disappear before they even existed. And now John was on his radar. He pulled into the precinct parking lot, killing the engine. The building loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights humming against the night sky. He didn't want to be here, but there were still loose ends that needed tying. Rex stayed in the car. John gave him a quick glance before stepping out. "Stay!" Rex didn't move, but his eyes stayed locked on John as he shut the door behind him. Inside, the precinct was buzzing. Officers moved back and forth, some hunched over desks, others arguing in low voices. The Jackal's takedown had sent ripples through the city, and the department was scrambling to figure out what it meant. John didn't stop to talk. He walked straight to Captain Morris's office, rapping his knuckles against the door before pushing it open. Morris looked up, his expression unreadable. "McBelt," John closed the door behind him. "You saw the reports." Morris nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I did." His eyes narrowed. "You went off the books." John crossed his arms. "Because the books don't do shit in this city." Morris exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent years watching guys like Vance turn this place into their personal empire?" He shook his head. "You think bringing down one lieutenant changes anything?" John's jaw tightened. "It's a start." Morris studied him for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "Grayson's gone." John frowned. "What?" "He was being held in an off-site facility. Someone pulled strings. Now he's gone." John felt his blood turn to ice. Morris kept his voice level. "Vance doesn't leave loose ends. You embarrassed him. And now Grayson isn't your problem anymore." John sat down slowly, his mind racing. "And what? We just pretend he never existed?" Morris exhaled, looking suddenly older. "You've been around long enough to know how this works. You take out a pawn, the king just replaces him." John shook his head. "No, not this time." Morris smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Then you better start playing smart." John stood. "I didn't come here for permission." Morris watched him for a moment, then leaned forward. "Then why did you come?" John hesitated. He wasn't sure anymore. Maybe he had come looking for backup, for a sign that there were still good cops left in this city, but he already knew the answer. He turned toward the door. "To let you know that when this all goes down, I won't be asking for help." Morris didn't stop him as he walked out. John sat in his car for a long time, staring at the city stretched out before him. Lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows over the streets. He had spent years thinking he could make a difference, that the badge meant something, but now he wasn't so sure. Rex let out a quiet huff from the passenger seat, breaking the silence. John glanced at him, exhaling. "You still trust me, huh?" Rex blinked, his expression unreadable. John smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, you're smarter than I am." He started the engine. He wasn't going home. Not yet. There was someone. He needed to see The bar was quiet, the kind of place where people drank alone, drowning their regrets in cheap whiskey. Carter was already there, nursing a glass of something dark, his expression unreadable. John slid into the seat across from him. Carter smirked. "That bad?" John exhaled. "Grayson's gone." Carter's smirk faded. "Shit," John nodded. "And we both know what that means." Carter leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Vance tied up a loose end, which means he's thinking ahead." John tapped his fingers against the table. "I need to know where he is." Carter scoffed. "You don't find Vance, he finds you." John clenched his jaw. "Then I'll make sure he has no choice." Carter studied him. "You really think you can win this?" John looked down at his drink, then at Rex, who sat at his feet, watching, waiting. "I don't know," he admitted. Carter sighed. "You got a death wish, McBelt." John smirked. "Not yet." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the city pressing down on them. Then Carter spoke. "I might know a guy." John leaned in. "Go on." Carter exhaled. "Underground bookkeeper. Used to handle accounts for the Jackals before they got too big. If anyone has records on Vance, it's him." John nodded. "Where?" Carter hesitated. Then quietly he said, "West Side. Old storage unit off 48th. John stood. "Let's go." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Now?" John grabbed his jacket. "You got somewhere else to be?" Carter smirked. "Guess not." They left the bar together, stepping out into the cold night air. John knew this wasn't over. The Jackals had regrouped. Vance had cleaned house. The game had changed, but John wasn't playing by their rules anymore. He looked down at Rex. "Ready?" Rex's ears perked, his body tense. John smirked. "Yeah, me too." They got in the car and drove toward the west. Aside, toward the next fight, toward whatever came next, because quitting wasn't an option, not anymore. The air felt heavier as John pulled onto 48th Street. The west side of Chicago wasn't a place people visited without a reason, and even then, it was best if that reason was worth the risk. The old storage unit Carter had mentioned sat between a boarded-up laundromat and a liquor store with a flickering neon sign. A single street lamp buzzed above, casting just enough light to highlight the cracks in the pavement, but not enough to make anyone feel safe. John killed the engine and glanced at Carter. "You sure this guy's still breathing?" Carter smirked, adjusting his jacket. "As of last week," John exhaled, looking toward the row of storage units. Most were rusted over, their roll-up doors dented and covered in graffiti. The one they were looking for had no markings, just a heavy-duty padlock that looked newer than everything else around it. Rex sat in the back seat, ears pricked, his body tense. He hadn't relaxed once since they left the precinct. Maybe he knew what John was starting to realize. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about staying alive. Carter stepped out first, stretching his arms as if they weren't about to knock on the door of someone who had every reason not to answer. John followed, adjusting his holster as they crossed the cracked sidewalk. Carter knocked twice, then once more after a pause. Silence. John's gut told him something wasn't right. He glanced at Rex, whose muscles were coiled, his stance alert. Then, movement. A faint shuffle from inside. A second later, a slot in the door slid open, revealing a pair of dark, wary eyes. "You, Carter." The voice was low, gravelly. Carter smirked. In the flesh, the eyes flicked to John. "Who's he?" John stepped closer. "The guy who's about to leave if you don't open this door." A pause. Then, reluctantly, the lock clicked. The door creaked open just wide enough for them to slip inside. John scanned the room. The storage unit was more of a makeshift office than a place for storing junk. A desk sat in the corner, stacked with paperwork, a couple of old filing cabinets against the far wall. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly. The man who let them in looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His beard was patchy, his shirt wrinkled, his hands twitchy. "You got 5 minutes," he muttered, locking the door behind them. Carter didn't waste time. "We're looking for anything you got on Vance." The man stiffened at the name. "You're joking." John crossed his arms. "Do we look like we're joking?" The man ran a hand over his face, muttering something under his breath. "You have no idea what you're asking. Try me." The man hesitated, then walked over to his desk, rifling through one of the drawers. He pulled out a small black notebook, flipping through pages filled with numbers, names, dates. "I used to handle money for a lot of people," he said. "Kept things clean, made sure no one asked too many questions." He stopped on a page, tapping it. "Vance doesn't just move product. He moves people. And not just the way you think." John's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" The man exhaled sharply. "There's a list. People who crossed him. People who got in the way. They don't just disappear, McBelt. They get used." John clenched his fists. The man flipped to another page, scribbled with a series of locations. "He has holding sites all over the city, places no one pays attention to. Old motels, warehouses, spots that look abandoned but aren't." John took the notebook, scanning the entries. Names, dates, places. Some he recognized, some he didn't. Then he froze. There, scribbled near the bottom, was a name that sent ice through his veins. "Grayson." John looked up. "This list, it's everyone Vance has leverage on?" The man nodded. "One way or another." John exhaled. He had thought Grayson was a loose end. Thought Vance had gotten rid of him to clean house. But if he was on this list, Grayson wasn't dead. John felt a rush of adrenaline hit him. "Where is he?" The man hesitated. "Look, just because his name's there doesn't mean—" "Where is he?" The man swallowed hard, then pointed at a location near the bottom, West End, some kind of processing facility. "People go in, they don't come out." John's grip on the notebook tightened. Carter sighed. "So Grayson's alive, and let me guess, he's not there by choice." The man shook his head. "No one ever is." John's mind was racing. If Grayson was still alive, then that meant one thing: Vance wasn't done with him. And if Vance wasn't done with him, he still had something to say. John closed the notebook and tucked it into his jacket. "You need to disappear." The man's face paled. "I already have." John didn't argue. He just nodded and turned toward the door. Rex was already ahead of him. Outside, the cold night air hit like a punch. John let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself. Carter looked at him. "So what's the play?" John smirked grimly. "We're going to get him." Carter scoffed. "Just like that?" John opened the car door, motioning for Rex to jump in. "Just like that," Carter sighed. "You ever get tired of being this reckless?" John didn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't have a choice. Grayson wasn't just a name on a list. He was the key to everything. If John wanted to bring down Vance, he needed him alive, and he wasn't going to let the jackals take that away from him. Not this time. He started the engine. The war wasn't just coming anymore. It was already here. The warehouse on the West End loomed ahead, its rusted exterior blending into the decay of an industrial district long forgotten by the rest of the city. The kind of place no one looked twice at, the kind of place people vanished in. John cut the engine a block away. The street was empty, silent, except for the distant hum of a passing freight train. He scanned the area, noting the lack of visible security. No guards at the doors, no patrols circling the perimeter. Too quiet. Beside him, Carter let out a slow breath. "Feels like a setup." John didn't disagree. "Feels like a chance." Carter shook his head, but there was no humor in his voice. "Man, you really don't do things the easy way, do you?" John smirked, but his grip on the wheel tightened. "Never had the option." Rex shifted in the back seat, his ears pricked, his body coiled with anticipation. He didn't need to be told what was about to happen. He knew. John exhaled. "All right, we go in. Quiet. We get Grayson out. We don't leave a trail." Carter gave him a flat look. "You think that's an option?" John checked his gun. "No." Carter sighed, then did the same. "Let's get this over with." They moved fast, keeping low, cutting across the lot toward the side entrance. The warehouse doors were thick steel, but the side panel was weaker, worn from years of neglect. Carter worked the lock with practiced ease, muttering under his breath about how predictable criminals were. Then the door creaked open. John stepped inside first, gun up, eyes sweeping the room. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust. Dim overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over rows of metal shelving. Empty, but the silence wasn't comforting. Carter followed, Rex slipping in behind him, his paws barely making a sound against the concrete. John motioned toward a doorway on the far side of the room. Holding cells would be in the back. Carter nodded. Let's move. They kept to the shadows, weaving through the warehouse. Every step felt heavier, every moment stretching into something unbearable. Then John heard it, a voice, weak, ragged. Help! He froze. Rex did too. Carter gave him a look. That's him? John nodded once. They moved faster now, abandoning. Caution! The voice came from a heavy metal door, reinforced with thick bolts. John tested the handle. Locked. Step back, Carter muttered. John did, just as Carter swung the butt of his gun against the locking mechanism. The first hit dented it. The second cracked it. The third sent it flying open. The smell hit them first. Sweat, blood, the kind of stale air that only came from a place no one was meant to leave. Grayson was slumped against the far wall, his hands tied in front of him, his face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Barely. John was at his side in an instant. Grayson! The ex-cop's eyelids fluttered, unfocused. Then, slowly, recognition flickered behind his bruised eyes. McBelt. John exhaled sharply. Yeah! You still in one piece? Grayson let out a wet, painful laugh. Define peace. Carter checked the hallway. We need to move. Now. John pulled out his knife, slicing through the ropes around Grayson's wrists. The man flinched but didn't fight it. He was too weak. Rex stayed close, his body tense, his eyes never leaving Grayson. John hauled him to his feet. Can you walk? Grayson groaned, but he nodded. Not well. That's enough. John threw one of Grayson's arms over his shoulder, guiding him toward the door. Carter was already moving ahead, checking every corner, every blind spot. They reached the main warehouse. Floor. That's when everything went to hell. The front doors burst open. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Jackals, armed, waiting. John shoved Grayson behind a stack of crates, ducking as the first shots rang out. Carter fired back, cursing. Guess they were expecting us. John gritted his teeth, firing off 2 shots, forcing their attackers to take cover. You think? Rex let out a low growl, his body pressed against the floor, waiting for an opening. John turned to Grayson. You hold a gun? Grayson let out a dry laugh. Not right now. John handed him a spare. Now you do. Grayson took it, his fingers barely steady, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he wasn't done fighting yet. John turned to Carter. We need a way out. Carter glanced around, then pointed toward a set of overhead catwalks. If we can get up there, there's a maintenance exit. John nodded. Go, I'll cover you. Carter didn't argue. He grabbed Grayson, hauling him up, guiding him toward the stairs. John fired again, keeping the jackals pinned. Rex moved beside him, silent, calculating. Then a shadow shifted. John barely had time to react before a figure lunged at him from the side. He hit the ground hard, his gun skidding across the floor. The jackal above him pressed a forearm against his throat, grinning through bloody teeth. Should have walked away, cop. John struggled, his vision blurring. Then a blur of Rex. The dog hit the attacker with the full force of his weight, sending the man sprawling. Before he could react, Rex's teeth were at his throat, a growl vibrating through the room. John coughed, pushing himself up. Rex! The dog hesitated, just for a second. Then he let go. The jackal gasped, clutching, his neck scrambling backward. He was alive, but only because Rex had chosen to let him be. John grabbed his gun and ran. Carter was already on the catwalk, firing down, covering them. Grayson was moving, slow but steady. John took the stairs 2 at a time, Rex right beside him. They reached the exit. Carter kicked it open. Go, go, go! They spilled out into the alleyway, the cold night air hitting them like a wall. John didn't stop. He half-dragged Grayson to the waiting car, shoving him into the back seat. Carter jumped in the passenger side. Rex leapt in last. John floored it. The warehouse shrank behind them. The jackals wouldn't be far behind. Carter was breathing heavy. "You get what you wanted?" John glanced at Grayson in the rearview mirror. The ex-cop coughed, smirking weakly. "Yeah," he rasped, "and you just made a lot of enemies." John exhaled. He knew, but for the first time they weren't just fighting alone. This was bigger than them now, and if the jackals thought they were going to win, they were dead wrong. John kept his foot on the gas, weaving through the city streets. Like a man being chased by ghosts. The jackals weren't far behind. He could feel them lurking just out of sight, regrouping, planning their next move. They wouldn't let this slide. Carter wiped blood from his forehead, letting out a slow breath. "That was fun," John shot him a glare. "You and I have very different definitions of fun." Carter smirked, rolling his sore shoulder. "Yeah, well, you're the one who dragged me into this." John didn't argue. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, glancing at the rearview mirror. Grayson sat slumped in the back seat, his breathing uneven. He looked worse under the dim glow of passing streetlights, his bruises darker, his skin pale. But his eyes were open, locked on John. "You should have left me there," Grayson muttered, voice hoarse. John scoffed. "You really think that was an option?" Grayson exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You don't get it," John gritted his teeth. "Then explain it to me." Grayson hesitated, then let out a bitter chuckle. "I'm already dead, McBelt. The second they grabbed me, it was over. Vance doesn't leave survivors." He leaned his head back against the seat. "And now you're on his list too." John clenched the wheel. "He already knows my name." Grayson's lips curled into something resembling a smirk. "Then, you're more screwed than I thought." Carter sighed. "I hate to break up the heart-to-heart, but we need to figure out where we're taking him." John had already decided that. "Safe house," Carter groaned. "Oh, for the love of—" "Not yours," John cut in. "Mine," Carter blinked. "You have a safe house?" John didn't answer. He just took the next turn, heading toward the outskirts of the city. The drive stretched on, intense silence. John could feel Rex shifting in the passenger seat, the dog's muscles still tight, still ready. He hadn't stopped watching Grayson since they got in the car. John reached over, scratching behind his ears. "We're almost there, buddy." Rex exhaled, but didn't relax. Neither did John. They arrived at a small, unremarkable house on the edge of an industrial park, tucked away where no one would think to look. John pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine. The air was still. Too quiet. Carter stepped out first, scanning the area. "Place looks abandoned." "That's the point," John muttered. He opened the back door, helping Grayson out. The ex-cop grunted, but he didn't resist. He was too weak to run, and even if he wasn't, there was nowhere left for him to go. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished, just the essentials. A couch, a kitchen table, a few chairs. The walls were bare, the air stale. John guided Grayson to the couch, setting him down carefully. "Stay here," Grayson smirked weakly. "Not going anywhere." John walked into the kitchen, Carter following. Behind. Carter leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "This is insane, you know that?" John grabbed a first aid kit from under the sink, popping it open. "Since when has that stopped us?" Carter sighed. "Fine. But what's the plan?" John pulled out a roll of bandages. "We use him." Carter frowned. "For what?" John turned, lowering his voice. "Grayson knows Vance's operation inside and out. If we want to take this guy down, we need him to talk." Carter scoffed. "And you think he will?" John's jaw tightened. "He doesn't have a choice." Carter studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "All right, let's see what he has to say." They walked back into the living room. Grayson looked up at them, his smirk fading. "Interrogation time," he muttered. John crouched in front of him. "Call it whatever you want, but you're gonna start talking." Grayson let out a slow breath. "And if I don't?" John's expression hardened. "Then you can take your chances with Vance." Grayson's smirk twitched, but it didn't last. He knew the truth as well as John did. There was no running from Vance, no hiding. Finally, he exhaled. "What do you want to know?" John leaned forward. "Everything." The next hour was filled with names, locations, operations that stretched deeper than John had realized. Vance didn't just run the jackals. He controlled half the city's underground network. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, it all led back to him. And worse, he had people everywhere. Cops, politicians, judges. John clenched his fists. "And how do we bring him down?" Grayson let out a hollow laugh. "You don't." John's stare didn't waver. "Try again," Grayson sighed. "Vance doesn't leave a paper trail. But there's one thing he cares about more than anything." Carter raised a brow. "And that is?" Grayson smirked. "His money." John frowned. "What about it?" Grayson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "He's got a stash. Not just cash, records. Proof of every deal, every payoff. It's the one thing keeping him untouchable." John's heart pounded. "Where?" Grayson hesitated. Then finally he said, "North side, old bank, basement level. That's where he keeps it all." John's mind raced. If they could get their hands on that, they could take Vance down for good. But there was just one problem. Vance would be expecting them. Carter ran a hand through his hair. "This is suicide." John smirked. "Yeah, but it's our best shot." Carter exhaled. "Fine, but we're gonna need help." John glanced at Rex, then back at Grayson. "Then we find it." Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "You're really gonna do this?" John stood. "Yeah." Grayson let out a slow breath. "Then you better not screw it up." John smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." He grabbed his phone, scrolling through. His contacts, if they were going to take down Vance, they needed to move fast, and they needed to hit first. Rex let out a quiet huff, shifting beside him. John looked down at him. "You ready?" Rex's ears perked, his body tense. John smiled. "Yeah, me too." The war wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. The night air clung to John's skin as he stood outside the abandoned bank on the north side. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark, its once pristine marble exterior now cracked and stained. With time, Vance's empire was built on shadows, and somewhere beneath this rotting structure, the proof of all his crimes was waiting. John flexed his fingers around the grip of his gun. He had been in a lot of bad situations before, but this one was different. This wasn't just a bust. This wasn't just another takedown. This was everything. Carter leaned against the side of the car, lighting a cigarette. "I can't believe I let you talk me into this." John smirked. "I didn't. You just hate loose ends." Carter exhaled smoke through his nose. "Yeah, well, this one's got a lot of teeth." John glanced at the back seat. Rex was there, his body coiled, ready. He'd been watching the building for the last 5 minutes, completely still, except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. John tapped the glass. "You good, buddy?" Rex blinked but didn't move. John turned back to Carter. "Once we get inside, we don't have time to second guess. We grab what we need and we get out." Carter scoffed. "Like it's ever that simple." John checked his gun, then nodded. "Let's move." They crossed the empty lot, their steps silent against the pavement. John tested the side door, locked, as expected. Carter knelt beside the handle, pulling out a set of old lockpicks. "Don't say it." John smirked. Didn't say a word. The lock clicked open. John pulled the door wide, gun raised. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and mildew. The bank's interior had been stripped of anything valuable years ago, but it still had that eerie quiet, the kind that made the hair on the back of John's neck stand up. Rex stepped inside first. John followed, keeping low. The bank's lobby stretched ahead of them, marble floors cracked and worn, old teller booths standing like ghosts of another era. The vault was deeper in, past the broken security barriers and the remnants of an office that had been gutted long ago. Carter moved ahead, glancing at a worn map on the wall. "Basements through there," John nodded. "Let's go." They reached the stairwell. the rusted door groaning as John pushed it open. The steps led downward into complete darkness, the kind that swallowed sound, the kind that made every breath feel too loud. John flicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing. Through the black Rex was already descending. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause. He knew they were close. At the bottom of the stairs, a long hallway stretched ahead of them. Doors lined both sides, most of them sealed shut. But at the end of the hall, one was open. John's pulse quickened. Carter raised an eyebrow. "That feel like an invitation to you?" John exhaled. "Only one way to find out." They moved carefully, checking each doorway as they passed. Most of the rooms were empty, old storage spaces, crumbling office cubicles. But then John reached the open door. Inside, a single metal table stood in the center of the room, and on top of it a laptop. John frowned. Carter let out a low whistle. "That's not ominous at all." John stepped inside, scanning the corners of the room. No cameras, no tripwires, just the laptop, its screen dark, waiting. Rex let out a low growl. John tapped the touchpad. The screen flickered to life, a video file. Carter groaned. "I really hate this." John clicked it. The footage was grainy, low quality, but the sound was crystal clear. A man's voice filled the room, smooth, calm, controlled. "John McBelt." John's blood turned to ice. The video showed a dimly lit office, the kind that belonged to men who didn't need to hide their power. Behind a massive desk sat a man in a dark suit, his face partially shadowed. But John didn't need to see him clearly. He already knew. Vance. The man leaned forward, folding his hands. "If you're watching this, that means you didn't listen," he smirked. "I can't say I'm surprised." Carter let out a breath. "Shit," Vance continued. "I'll make this simple. You don't walk away from this, McBelt. You don't get to be the hero. You don't get to win." John's fingers curled into a fist. "You have something that belongs to me," Vance said. "Grayson. And I want him back." John exchanged a look with Carter. Vance's smirk widened. "You see, I don't mind losing pawns, but I do mind losing control. So here's what's going to happen." He leaned back, exhaling. "You're going to bring him to me, and if you don't..." The video cut. Static filled the screen. Then new footage. John's stomach dropped. The screen showed an apartment complex. His apartment complex. The camera panned slowly, zooming in on his door. Then the screen went black. John's breath came out slow, measured. He forced his heartbeat to steady. Carter muttered, "Well, that's not great." John didn't respond. He turned, walking out of the room. Carter followed. "What's the move?" John reached the stairs, taking them two at a time. "We get back to Grayson." Rex was already ahead of them, his body tense. They hit the ground level, stepping into the cold air. John pulled out his phone, dialing. Grayson answered on the second ring. "Took you long enough?" John didn't waste time. "You still at the safe house?" A pause, then, "Yeah, why?" John's stomach twisted. "Lock the doors." Grayson chuckled. "Oh, that's comforting. What the hell's going on?" John's grip on the wheel tightened. "Vance knows where you are." Silence, then a slow exhale. "Well," Grayson muttered, "guess I should have seen that coming." John glanced at Carter. "We're coming to you. Stay put." Carter raised an eyebrow as John hung up. "You really think he's just going to sit tight?" John started the car. "No." Rex let out a quiet huff from the passenger seat. John exhaled. "Yeah, buddy, I know. This wasn't just about Grayson anymore. This was about making a stand." Vance had been pulling strings for too long, playing games from the shadows. John was done playing. He shifted into gear, tires screeching against the pavement. By the time this was over, one of them wouldn't be walking away, and John had no intention of losing.